Now let's take a look at Chapter 5. And the concepts covered in Chapter 5 are collectively called cost, volume, profit. And to introduce those concepts, let's take a look at a few terms. The first one is sales, which is sometimes called revenues. And sales or revenues are the price of goods sold or services provided. So some examples of revenue. If a grocery store sells a gallon of milk, the price of that gallon of milk is sales or revenue for the grocery store. If an auto dealership sells a car, the price of that car is sales revenue for the auto dealership. If a lawyer provides legal services for a client, the price of those services provided to the client are sales revenue for the law firm. Now let's take a look at two types of cost or two types of expenses. The first one being variable expenses. Sometimes called variable cost. And variable expenses or variable cost are costs that change directly and proportionately with some measure of volume. And for right now, our measure of volume will just be sales. So for instance, a variable expense for the grocery store is what it pays to buy that gallon of milk that it sells, what it pays to the dairy. And if milk sales increase by 10%, that cost, that expense for buying the milk should also increase by 10%, directly and proportionally. And if milk sales decrease by 5%, the cost of the milk should also decrease by 5%. In the case of the auto dealership, sales commissions typically are a variable expense. And if sales increase by 10%, sales commissions paid to the salespeople should also increase by 10%. And if sales decrease by 15%, sales commissions should also decrease for that auto dealership by 15%. Now let's take a look at fixed expenses, sometimes called fixed cost. And those are costs that are not affected by volume. And an example of fixed expenses for the grocery store might be property taxes. If their sales go up by 10% or down by 10%, that should not affect the amount of property taxes that they pay to the county or the city. And the same with the auto dealership. If they sell 10% more cars or 5% less cars, that should not affect the amount of property taxes that they pay. Now let's take a look at putting those three definitions together into a model, and we'll use that model to address some basic business questions. So let's say sales minus variable expenses. And sales minus variable expenses, let's say, is equal to contribution margin. Now, contribution margin is a new term, but I do not need to define it. You know what it is. It is the difference between sales and variable expenses. Now, let's say minus fixed expenses is equal to net income or profit. And there's our model. Now, let's put some numbers in that model. Let's say sales for last month are $100,000. And let's say variable cost or variable expenses for last month are $60,000. So contribution margin right there is going to be equal to 100,000 minus 60,000. There's my Excel formula. And that gives me 40,000 in contribution margin. Let's say fixed expenses are 35,000. So net income is going to be equal to 40,000 in contribution margin minus 35,000 in fixed expenses, or $5,000. Your task is to go right over here, right there, and answer this question. And answer this question by filling in those cells. If sales increase by 50%, what will our net income be? If sales increase by 50%, what will our net income be? So pause the video right now and see if you can answer that question. Determine the amount of net income. So let's take a look at a 50% increase in sales. I'm going to say 100,000 times 1.5 to give me a 50% increase in sales up to 150,000. And I can just copy that formula and paste. And if sales increase by 50%, variable expenses should also increase by 50%. So a 50% increase in variable expenses will give me variable expenses of $90,000. And my new level of contribution margin is going to be equal to 150 minus 90, $60,000. Notice contribution margin has also increased by 50%. Now, since the only thing that changed here was volume, the level of sales, I'm going to assume that fixed expenses remain the same. So my new level of net income is 60,000 in contribution margin minus 35,000 in fixed expenses. That gives me 25,000. So sales increased by 50% and net income increased by a whole lot more than that, from 5,000 up to 25,000. Can you compute the percentage increase in net income? Pause the video and see if you can do that. So we had a 50% increase in sales. A 50% increase in sales. The increase in net income was 25,000 minus 5,000. A $20,000 increase in net income. And the percentage increase in net income is 20,000, the total increase divided by the starting point, which was 5,000 in net income, and that gives me a 400% increase in net income. So a 100% increase would increase net income from 5,000 to 10,000. A 200% increase would increase to 15,000. A 300% increase would increase to 20,000. And a 400% increase would be net income of 25,000. Now let's take that model and modify it just a little bit. Let me copy and paste right down here. So we have a few definitions, 3 definitions. We put those definitions together in the form of a model, and we use that model to address a basic business question, which was, if sales increase by 50%, what will happen to net income? Now let's expand the model just a little bit. Let me put units right up here. And since your authors use the variable Q, or quantity, to denote units, let me put that in parentheses. And right here, let's say total. And over here, let's say per unit. And let me give you some basic information over here in the per unit column. In the per unit column and on the sales row, let me put $250. That is the selling price per unit for this product, whatever it is. And for variable cost or variable expenses, let me put $150. And for total fixed expenses, let me put $35,000. So those are your three basic pieces of information. The selling price per unit of $250. Clearly this is not a gallon of milk, but something else. The variable expenses per unit of $150, and fixed expenses per month, since fixed expenses typically come in per time period bundles, fixed expenses per month of $35,000. Your task is to determine net income if we sell 3,000 units. So there are my total units. Total units, 3,000 units. So you pause the video and see if you can compute net income for 3,000 of these units sold. Now let's take a look at that. If we sell 3,000 units at $250 each, then our sales are going to be 3,000 times 250, or total sales of $750,000. Our variable expenses are going to be 3,000 times 150, the variable expenses per unit, and that's going to give us $450,000 in variable expenses. So contribution margin is sales minus variable expenses. 300,000 minus fixed expenses of 35,000 gives us net income of $265,000. Now let's relate what we've done to the text. On page 189 in your book, your authors show this income statement. Looks pretty much like ours, except we show our units on a separate row. They show their units on the same row as the sales in parentheses. Other than that, not much difference. The same per unit information, $250 selling price, $150 in variable expense per unit, as we have. And if I change my units to 400, I should get the same operating income and the same other information. So let me do that. Let me just change that number right there to 400 units. And if I wrote my formulas correctly, I should end up with 40,000 in contribution margin and 5,000 in net income. And so now those two income statements, mine and the one in the text, are exactly the same. They show some additional information. A contribution margin per unit. So let's take a look at that. That goes right there in my structure, and I can say sales minus variable expenses in the per unit column, just as I did in the total column. So let me say sales of $250, the selling price per unit, minus variable expenses of $150, the variable expense per unit, and that gives me $100 in contribution margin per unit. Now let's take a look at some additional concepts. Get this page 189 information out of the way. On page 191, your authors take a look at the equation approach to analyzing cost, volume, profit. Let me scrunch that up just a little. And they say Sales minus variable expenses minus fixed expenses equals profit. And of course, that's exactly what we do in our contribution income statement. We say sales minus variable expenses. And when we do that, we subtotal for contribution margin. And then we say minus fixed expenses, just like they do, to get profit. Also, your authors on that same page, using the equation approach, scrunch this up just a little, show price times quantity, just like we did. We set a price of $2.50 per unit times quantity of 400 units, and that gave us sales of $100,000. And then the equation approach says minus variable cost per unit times quantity, and that's what we did. We said variable cost per unit times a quantity of 400 units gave us variable expenses of $60,000. So if we put that together, we get contribution margin. Price times quantity for total sales minus variable cost per unit times quantity for total variable expenses. That gives us contribution margin. And then the next thing we say is minus fixed expenses, just like we did in our contribution income statement, to get profit or net income. So that's the equation approach and the formula approach to that same information. Now let me show you a shortcut method for arriving at profit. We said 400 units times $250 per unit to get sales of 100,000. And then we said 400 units times $150 per unit in variable expenses to get variable expenses of 60,000. And then we subtracted those two to get contribution margin of 40,000. I now want to take a look at computing contribution margin directly with just those two pieces of information. So let me get rid of those four items and drop back in my contribution margin per unit of $100. And so now I'm going to say 400 units times $100 in contribution margin per unit to compute contribution margin directly. 400 times 100 is 40,000 in contribution margin, and then minus my 35,000 in fixed expenses gives me net income or profit of 5,000. So that was a two-step computation for profit. I said units times contribution margin per unit, and then I subtracted fixed expenses of 35,000 to get net income. Now in that series of computations, you were given the top number in the income statement, quantity or number of units sold, and you computed net income. Let's work the other way. Let's get rid of all of this. Now, given the bottom number in the income statement, net income or profit, can you find number of units? Suppose you want to have 40,000 in net income, and you know that you have 35,000 in fixed expenses, and you also know that contribution margin per unit is $100. The question is, How many units do you need to sell to earn $40,000 in profit or $40,000 in net income? Why don't you pause the video and see if you can compute that number. How many units to sell to earn $40,000 in profit? So let's take a look at that. First question I can answer is how much contribution margin do I need? And the answer to that is just enough to cover fixed expenses of $35,000 and leave $40,000 left as net income or profit. So I need to add those two things together to compute needed contribution margin. So I'm going to say $40,000 plus $35,000, and there's how much contribution margin I need. $75,000 in contribution margin. Now every unit gives me $100 in contribution margin. So 1 unit gives me $100, 2 units gives me $200, and so on. A few minutes ago, you knew those two numbers, and you multiplied number of units times contribution margin per unit to get contribution margin. In this case, we know these two numbers, and the question is, how many units do we have to sell if each unit earns a contribution margin of $100 to generate $75,000 in contribution margin? And we can compute that by saying contribution margin of $75,000 divided by contribution margin per unit of $100. And that gives us 750 units that we need to sell to earn a net income or a profit of $40,000. That is the second basic business question that we've answered in this presentation. The first one was, if sales increase by 50%, by how much will net income increase? And this question is, how many units do we need to sell to earn a target profit of $40,000? Your book makes these computations on page 202. And notice they do the same thing that we did. We added 35,000 and 40,000 to get to 75,000. And that's exactly what they do. The 40,000 and 35,000 are added together, and then we divided that by 100 to get 750 units. Your authors divide by 100 and get 750 unit sales to attain a target profit of $40,000. Now, let's see if you can work exercise 5-6. Compute the level of sales required to attain a target profit. And it says, Lyman Corporation has a single product whose selling price is $140 and whose variable expense is $60 per unit. The company's monthly fixed expense is $40,000. For requirement 1, we're to solve for the unit sales required to earn a target profit of $6,000. For requirement 2, you have to do the same thing for a target profit of $8,000. Now this says use the equation method and use the formula method. You can use any method you like. I suggest that you use the income statement that we used to solve for these two target profit amounts. So why don't you pause the video and see if you can work exercise 5-6. Okay, let's take a look at this together. First of all, let me copy and paste. Copy. And paste my structure, which is the key to solving these problems. Let's get rid of the old numbers. And let's also get rid of all of that information. And let's drop in the information for requirement 1. The selling price is $140 per unit. and variable expenses are $60 per unit, and monthly fixed expenses are $40,000. For requirement 1, to earn a target profit of $6,000, we need enough contribution margin to cover fixed expenses of $40,000 and target profit of $6,000. We need contribution margin of $40,000 plus $6,000. We need contribution margin of $46,000. Each unit gives us a contribution margin of 140 minus 60. Each unit gives us a contribution margin of $80. So to compute how many units I need to sell to earn a target profit of $6,000, I'm going to say 46,000 divided by 80. And that gives me 575 units for requirement 1. For requirement 2, let me copy and paste right there. And let's go back to our original information, which is only 3 pieces of data, the 140 and 60 selling price per unit and variable expense per unit, and the 40,000 in fixed expenses. So for requirement 2, we have 8,000 in target profit, and they add those two together to get my contribution margin. I say 40,000 plus 8,000, and that gives me 48,000 in contribution margin, total contribution margin. And my contribution margin per unit is 140 minus 60, and that gives me $80 in contribution margin per unit. So to compute units, to earn an $8,000 net income, I'm going to say 48,000 divided by 80. 600 units to earn a target profit of $8,000. And that's exercise 5-6, and that completes our introduction to cost, volume, profit in Chapter 5. You should review this video a couple of times, rework all of the examples, and be prepared for the quiz Monday afternoon.